Okay. Let's go to Bentham and Mill. We did Bentham on Tuesday, but let me just remind you of what I'm calling here the extremism of Bentham. And extremism for me is not always a terrible thing, so I'm just trying to establish what his extremism is. Bentham, as we saw, introduces a radical new moral, political, social, and economic calculus for humanity. It is one that, as he told us, hews to a very simple principle: maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. This principle, as we saw last time, is literally intended to displace all other principles at the level of what Bentham calls the is and the ought. That is, maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain is what human beings do. He believes that's how we tick. That's what runs us. But this calculus, how to maximize pleasure or minimize pain, also ought to be the guide for all social and political policy. Achieving the greatest good for the greatest number is the utilitarian principle for making good legislation in Bentham's view. And achieving the greatest good for the greatest number is maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain for as many as you can. So the principle is very simple, but as we saw last time, the application of it is not, especially when it comes to governing and managing society. It requires, as we saw last time, manipulating interest, and interest is, in Bentham's understanding, simply the agglomeration of an individual's pleasure-pain calculus. So your interest is whatever maximizes your pleasures, minimizes your pains. But interest has to be manipulated both to produce well-behaved subjects who aren't just wanton, anarchic, slothful, or destructive hedonists, but it also is required to produce an orderly, productive society. And Bentham's really explicit about this manipulation. It's not like you have to read between the lines to see it. On page 93, he actually tells us that the legislator has only one tool for fashioning behavior, what he calls the organization, I'm quoting him, the organization of pain and pleasure. And then on 96, he says this is the last time I'll quote him: pleasures and the avoidance of pains are the ends the legislator has in view. Pleasures and pains are the instruments he has to work with. The instruments he has to work with. So, manipulating our interest, orchestrating our interest, and organizing legislation such that it causes us great pain, to be non-well-behaved, non-productive individuals, and gives us pleasure to be the opposite. That's what Bentham is going to do in designing legislation, as well as social opinion and social norms, organizing space, as we saw last time in thinking about the panopticon, setting up society as a workshop. Now, last time we also saw the really extreme consequences of Bentham's insistence on this principle as the governing principle for all human existence. That is, last time we saw not only does Bentham introduce social manipulation and engineering at both the legislative and the governance and social level, not only does he introduce behaviorism on a large scale, but he also sets out to eliminate all other moral measures of us. He's getting rid of the concepts of good and evil. He sees these as just wrong-headed ways of speaking. There's no intrinsic value, he says, to piety, to honor, to virtue, to responsibility or loyalty, even to promising. Moreover, However, Bentham is also eliminating the very idea and practice of public life as a distinctive good or distinctive form of association for humans. He does not see us as having intrinsically common ends or as having some intrinsic need or value in participating in common life. And he eliminates the idea of the pursuit of justice or freedom or shared power as a basis for human engagement with political life or even as the basis for political life itself. We also saw that Bentham has no real appreciation for what Marx taught us to see as the historicity of our desires. That is, the extent to which we are shaped historically and socially by particular conditions, in which our desires are not just constants, but are generated culturally and socially. Even if Bentham recognizes at times that our desires have been shaped historically or culturally or socially, that's irrelevant to the pleasure maximizer's calculations. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is the picture Bentham gives of us and of how we're to be appropriately governed and how we're to be thought about is pretty extreme. What do we do with this extreme picture? One possibility is obviously just to reject utilitarianism as a way of understanding the human being that is so reductionistic and so, in a sense, ignoble and undignified, so absurdly narrow and crass that we should just set it aside. But another possibility, especially if you think Bentham's onto something, but he's maybe just gone a little far, is to make one of two moves. One move is to say, okay, utilitarianism has a point. We are pleasure maximizers. But this shouldn't be the only governing principle. It shouldn't be raised to the level of the supreme governing principle for all of us. There ought to be some other things that we consider when we're thinking about justice or human development or living well together on earth or being people who live together, say, from diverse cultures and that sort of thing. So one possibility is just to reduce the standing of utilitarianism to one among other governing principles. Another possibility is to modify utilitarianism itself to include things other than pleasure and pain. To have a picture of human beings who, yes, want pleasure and want to avoid pain, but also might have other things at stake, might have a little more going than that. Both these moves, the reduction of utilitarianism to one among other governing principles and the modification of it to include, to give a bigger picture of us, both these moves are the moves John Stuart Mill makes. And it's our engagement with Mill over the next week and a half that, again, will explain why we read Marx and Bentham out of order chronologically. We need Mill pressed right up against Bentham in order to see what Mill accepts from Bentham and what he rejects from Bentham. The influence of Bentham on Mill is huge. So let me tell you that story now. John Stuart Mill is the oldest son of James Mill, who you will recall from Tuesday was one of the Benthamites, that philosophical circle around Bentham who thought he had the truth and was devoted to helping to translate and disseminate this truth. But that's not the only influence of Bentham on Mill. It's not just through his father's rapture with Bentham's ideas. His father, James Mill, John's father, James Mill, abetted by Jeremy Bentham, decided to make an experiment out of little John's upbringing. Not one they considered risky because they were so certain of its positive outcome. Both Bentham and James Mill, believed they had really grasped the principles of what they took to be the new science of man. And they were convinced that if they raised little John according to these principles, that he would be preserved from ignorance and weakness. And ignorance and weakness they took to be the two great sources of unreason in thought and action, as well as the chief sources of misery and vice. So their plan was to raise John as a rational being, living amongst other rational beings, namely themselves, by educating John at home in radical isolation from other children and other less rationally educated beings, which we think probably includes Mrs. Mill. And John's education was indeed a remarkable one. It was not only supremely rational, it was quite intense. By the age of 5, he knew ancient Greek. By the age of 9, he knew algebra and Latin. And you thought you were something. He learned natural sciences and the classical literatures by the age of 12, but he was taught no religion, no metaphysics, no poetry, no romantic literature, nothing that Bentham and Mill understood to be the, as Bentham put it, accumulation of human idiocy and error. Now, it's important to remember that this education is occurring amidst what is historically a huge upsurge of romantic intellectual currents that are starting in Europe to press against 18th century rationalism. And so James Mill is really, in some ways, the last of the great 18th century rationalists. Okay, what happens in this experiment? Well, it was a horrifying success. At the age of 12, John had the erudition of an educated 35-year-old and was a supremely reasoning being. You can picture him. You've run into these kids. They were in your school, here and there. You just think back, that little 12-year-old who just talked like a little rational robot. His father was delighted. He believed he had produced an excellent, I'm quoting, excellently informed, perfectly rational creature. Moreover, at 15, John Stuart, began his own close study of Bentham's work and began, appropriately, writing utilitarian tracts for various left-wing papers. But you can probably guess, because we are more psychologically inclined in our age than some might have been then, something had to give. At 17, John was fully mentally formed. He was described by Jeremy and James as clear-headed, candid, articulate, serious, and without any trace of fear, vanity, or humor. At the age of 19, he cracked. He fell into what John Stuart Mill will later describe in his autobiography as, and I need to quote it precisely, a condition in which his emotions were starved while my mind was violently overdeveloped. He experienced terrible despair, a monumental lack of purpose, and paralysis of the will, what we would today call a very deep and dark depression. Even in this state, however, he was able to ask a perfectly rational question of his condition. And the question was this, from his autobiography. If the Benthamite ideal of universal happiness, in which I have been taught to believe, were realized, would this in fact fulfill my desires? His answer was a horrifying no. So what was the true end of life? He couldn't see one. Everything seemed to him dry and bleak, without purpose. He felt no motive for continuing his life and longed for its end. He suspected, he tells us in the autobiography, that he was not a perfected human being, but a horribly atrophied and monstrous one, without a crucial part of what he called normal human nature. This is all retrospective. At the time, I don't know that he would have had a language for normal human nature, because that's not part of his curriculum. Now, fortunately, this crack happened, this depression happened before the age of antidepressants. And I say that because what happens next gives us the political philosopher that is often hailed as modernity's greatest theorist of individual liberty. And I'm not saying that to attack antidepressants. I'm just saying if he'd been put on them, the next stage might not have happened, and here's what happens. One day, despite his despair, John Stuart was reading a story by Marmontel, about a son who loses his father and grieves him and then imagines taking his place in the family. Now, those of you familiar with Freud can already do an analysis on this. But the important part is, as he's reading this story about the son who loses the father and grieves the father, Mill cried. And his sobbing, which was cathartic in a very distinctive way, convinced him that he was capable of feeling. And he was transformed by this. And this, in turn, began to transform his beliefs, to move him away from pure rationalism and steely utilitarianism. And he began reading frenetically. He read Wordsworth and Coleridge and other poets. He immersed himself in the romantic intellectual works of the time, but he never radically broke with his father or with Bentham. To the contrary, he actually ended up remaining convinced of many of the philosophical tenets of utilitarianism. He stayed true to the end to the idea of governing according to the best for the many, utilitarian faith in reason and analysis and empirical science, and utilitarian critique of dogmatism and transcendentalism and obscurantism. What shifted for Mill, though, and what he's going to inject into utilitarianism, what shifted is the conception of human beings and what possibly gratifies us and what our purposes are. And that's what's going to make a new and really different animal out of utilitarianism. So Mill continued to profess that happiness was the sole end of human existence. But his conception of what produces happiness is really going to change. It won't simply be rationality or satisfaction of desire. Instead, he's going to place emphasis on these kinds of values. Diversity. And not diversity the way we mean it today, but diversity in the sense of just great variety in human life and among human beings. Versatility, fullness of life, realization of one's possibilities, elevated pleasures, but also the leap of genius and imagination and originality, spontaneity, the uniqueness of individuals, noble feelings and ideas, great capacities for compassion and generosity, as well as the depth of love. So what Mill comes to fear and write against, but he comes to fear and write against it in utilitarian terms, were some of Bentham's own strongest tendencies in utilitarian thinking. In other words, what Mill takes out after is narrowness, uniformity, the crushing of individuals by the weight of public opinion or purely rational calculation. He set himself against the worship of order and tidiness and even peace if they're bought at the point of obliterating the variety and the color of human beings and the high passions and untrammeled imaginations of human existence. So this means also that what Mill comes to cherish above all is liberty, individual liberty. And along with individual liberty, or sometimes it would seem as a purpose or aim for individual liberty, individuality. Individual liberty and individuality, cultivating the possibilities and the uniqueness of the individual, these Mill saw as the ultimate values in life, something we couldn't find in Bentham's utilitarianism. So with Mill, the emphasis of utilitarianism is going to shift decidedly according to his esteem for what we might call the inner person on one side, the importance of developing our interiors, all those things that were so thwarted and undeveloped in Mill as a youngster. So developing the inner person on the one side, and on the other side, what he considers the kind of ineffable features of human splendor and human possibility on the other. Our capacities for greatness, inventiveness, imagination, accomplishment, subtlety of feeling, and so forth. And he thought both of those things, that inner person and those capacities for achievement and development, could be cultivated only through giving maximum birth to freedom in action and in thought, and above all, in choosing one's own ends. Now, over the course of our work with Mill over these next 3 sessions, I'm going to be arguing that his persistence within a utilitarian frame, while shifting its conception of human beings and their ends, is going to make for some pretty weird political theory. It's going to make for some deep confusions and incoherences. It's not for nothing that Mill's work on liberty has been both hailed as the greatest tribute to human individual liberty ever written, and also referred to by contemporary scholars as a careless masterpiece. In it, you'll see Mill's struggle to reconcile a series of different things that don't always reconcile so perfectly, and more generally across his life, we see him attempt to reconcile capitalism, socialism, utilitarianism, libertarianism, gender equality, and some other things that don't all add up very well together. That is not to disparage him as a political theorist. We've seen tensions and limitations in every theorist that we have studied, and I'm just giving you a little foretaste of what part of the problem is going to be as we look at Mill. But first we need to get through the remaining 50 years of his life before we watch it unfold as the life of a political theorist and political activist. We have one more transformative crisis to install in it. It's already been pretty dramatic for a young life, but at 24, something else happened. John Stuart Mill met Harriet Taylor, and they fell madly in love, and they remained so for decades. But there was a problem. There was a Mr. Taylor. Harriet was married and remained married for the next 21 years. And their relationship, Mill's and Taylor's, was formally platonic, very intense. She apparently had very little use for what she considered her very dull husband. She also apparently didn't have a lot of use for raising her 3 children. But Mill thought she was incomparably brilliant. She claimed she was the source of his greatest thinking. There's a huge debate about this in the Mill scholarship. Some claim that Mill was the only person on earth who actually could see anything very remarkable in her, but others claimed that she really was responsible for the best and most radical tendencies in his thought. That debate will go on forever. What is certain is that her trapped position in a marriage that she was miserable in, and her own feminism inspired a great deal of Mill's feminist passion, which you'll be reading about next week, and her socialist commitments also pushed him way closer to socialism than he might have otherwise gone. They wrote some articles together. She authored an essay of her own on the enfranchisement of women that would eventually lead to Mill's much more famous tract you're reading next week on the subjection of women. And Mill claimed that her thought rested under his name in almost everything he wrote. You can see this in the dedication on page 4 of your reading for this week, the dedication to her in On Liberty. He published On Liberty shortly after her death, and he claimed more generally that she was responsible for all of the ideas which would make him famous. Anyway, in case you're worried about what happened to them eventually, they finally were able to marry when her husband died after 21 years of this intense relationship. And then they had 7 years together before Harriet died. Okay, so aside from these hugely salient issues in Mill's life, what else? Mill was once described by an undergraduate teacher of mine as a man who lived too long and wrote too much. His collected works amount to 20 massive volumes. These range from vast numbers of newspaper articles to giant systematic tomes such as The System of Logic and the Principles of Political Economy, Representative Government, Essays on Religion. There are also lots of unfinished things such as the work on socialism. You have a few chapters of that at the tail end of the edition of Mill that you're reading. He also wrote a huge and splendid autobiography and much, much more. It's also worth noting that he was doing much of this writing at a time of enormous intellectual and political ferment in Europe. 1859 was the date that On Liberty was published. This was also the date of Darwin's Origin of the Species and when Marx's first works on political economy were coming out. It was a time of feminist as well as socialist ferment in Europe, as well as a number of other kinds of political struggles and crises. Now, in addition to his writing, as I mentioned briefly, Mill was also a tireless activist. His activism was always aimed at broadening the reach of freedom and alleviating misery. Those were his two big causes. So freedom of speech, the extension of liberties and the enfranchisement to all men and to women, promotion of public education, promotion of religious tolerance, relief of poverty. These were his issues. He was what we would call, in the contemporary sense of the word liberal, a tireless liberal activist. He was actually a member of Parliament from 1865 through 1868, but he was largely frustrated by what he couldn't accomplish there, especially the issue of women's suffrage. It was a big, big struggle for him, and he failed at the time to get it pushed through. He published The Subjection of Women, which you're reading next week, in 1869, and that produced a huge storm of controversy around what at that point was a very famous figure. He had great standing. And soon after that, he grew ill and died 4 years later. So that's the life. Okay, let's turn now to liberty. We need to start with Mill's own formulation on page 13. It's really nice when somebody writes an essay and then they have a paragraph that begins, the object of this essay. So here we go. First full paragraph. The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle. As entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. So we're going to have one principle that's going to govern absolutely, a little echo of one principle governing absolutely that Bentham offered, but it's going to be a really different principle. And this principle will govern whether we're talking about law and penalties or whether we're talking about social opinion and norms. So it's going to govern in both politics and society. What is that principle? That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. So the only reason that you can ever interfere in another's liberty is to protect yourself. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So you can only interfere in somebody's liberty if you're protecting yourself from harm they're doing to you by using their liberty. And the only reason power can ever be used to interfere in someone's liberty is to prevent harm to another. But in addition to this principle, what we need to note in this passage is how every theme that Mill is going to emphasize is here. Not utility, not reason, but liberty is the supervening principle. And the liberty that Mill cherishes is, of course, precisely the one we saw disappear into the maw of social manipulation in Bentham. Bentham wasn't so concerned about this liberty. He was concerned about getting us to be rational maximizers, but also organized, manipulated often to be organized into being productive and rational human beings if we couldn't do it ourselves. And yet, Mill's not throwing out rationalism or reason, far from it. I have so far dwelt on Mill's rebellion against the rationalist, calculating, and conformist dimensions of utilitarian doctrine because it's key to understanding how Mill's transforming it. His great loathings, Mill's great loathings, are not irrationality, not wrong-headed pursuits, but conformity, standardization, narrowness, dullness. Mill admired Tocqueville enormously, and he often quoted Tocqueville's anxiety that the society being born in democracy was one that rendered human objectives and human endeavors increasingly narrow and made men into what Tocqueville and Mill would call mere industrious sheep. So Mill worried that collective mediocrity was gradually strangling originality, inventiveness, creativity, human potential. And Mill hated timidity and mildness and ordinariness and passivity. But unlike Tocqueville, for Mill, these things that he hated weren't going to be contested by cultivating political participation or associations or Republican virtue. Rather, he also didn't actually share Tocqueville's worry about our increasing isolation from one another. He didn't worry about the specter of an increasingly isolated, self-interested society. For Mill, as we'll see, there's no such thing as too much isolation from one another. Isolation is actually going to be something of the condition for developing our individuality, our spontaneity, our gifts. In fact, he's going to begin theorizing the idea that individuals have to be somewhat protected from one another's overweening influence and attempt to dominate each other. The terrible weight of social pressure, peer pressure, public opinion, all of that has to be pushed back a little bit if we're going to cultivate our own gardens, be each and all that we can be. So what do we have? So far, we have in Mill a theory of individuality and its close relationship to liberty. Liberty serves individuality. And that theory of individuality and close relationship to liberty and to toleration, letting everybody just do their own thing. You can't get in the way of anybody for any reason except that it might hurt you. You can't get in the way of anybody just because you think it's not good for them to be doing what they're doing. This theory is going to come closer than any other theory we're going to read this term to the dominant ethos in American society. And that means, of course, we have to make ourselves give it careful scrutiny. It's really easy with John Stuart Mill to just read and nod, read and nod, read and nod. And we have to fight that because we want to understand what's going on here theoretically. It's not just something to assent to, even if at the end you want to affirm Mill's values. We also need to see, even though I said it comes close to our contemporary view, we need to see how it differs from contemporary formulations of individual liberty. For example, Mill's argument for liberty is not rooted in rights. He inherits from Bentham that idea that rights don't really have any natural or foundational standing. It's not as radically opposed to their presence in government, in civil society as Bentham, but it's not at the center of his theory. And it's also the case that Mill's account of the relationship between liberty and individuality has some very deep tensions in it. To start with, liberty and tolerance are not natural to us. They have to be cultivated against our natural inclinations, as we'll see in a moment. And his insistence on the importance of liberty is not founded in a belief in the relativism of opinion. That is, he's not going to argue for free speech because nothing's true and everybody just has their own opinion. He's not going to argue that there's an impossibility of ever knowing who's really right. Rather, he's going to argue for a progressive conviction about the eventual emergence of truth out of a world of competing error and argument and deliberation. And finally, another difference that we're going to see between Mill and many of our contemporary views is that in the West, he believes that all in the West ought to be free, but he thinks most of us will squander that freedom, that we won't use it well. So there's going to turn out to be a very strong elitism in Mill's argument. We'll deal with these one at a time, some today, some next week. But first, let's really start by getting at what he means by liberty. On page 15, I'm not going to read this, I'm just going to refer you to it. He says, liberty pertains to the portion of a person's life and conduct which affects only himself. Or, he adds, if it affects others, only with their free, voluntary, undeceived consent and participation. So liberty pertains to the portion of our life and conduct which only affects ourselves, or if it affects others, it's only with the consent or participation, open and avowed, of another. And then he adds, still in the first full paragraph of 15, that the region of liberty, the territory of liberty, the territory of concern of liberty, is conscience, thought, feeling, opinion, conscience, thought, feeling, opinion, writing, tastes, pursuits, and associations. So this is what liberty pertains to. It pertains to individual conscience and thought and feeling, opinion, writing, our tastes, what we want to pursue as individuals, and who we want to associate with. And then he gives you a kind of summary of liberty on page 16, top of 16, first full paragraph. Second sentence, the only freedom which deserves the name, is that of pursuing our good good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to attain it. So, liberty comes down to pursuing our own good in our own way. Each, he says, is the proper guardian of his own health, bodily, mental, or spiritual. So far, pretty simple. What we know is that liberty for Mill is really familiar to us. It's defined as freedom from interference by two different orders. On the one hand, freedom from interference by magistrates or legislators, police or laws, and freedom from interference by public opinion and social coercion. Nobody can tell us what to do or just disapprove of us and make us do otherwise. So freedom has as its venue, or it has as its potential incursions the state and the social. And the project of On Liberty is to make the case for the widest possible berth for individual liberty against these two sources of impediment. Mill, in other words, offers the classic definition of what has come to be called negative liberty. That is, liberty that pertains precisely to being able to do what you want without being interfered with or impeded by another. It's not Tocqueville's liberty. It's not freedom to. It's freedom from. It's not freedom to participate or freedom to govern yourself in common with others. The value of liberty lies for Mill not in the making of popular sovereignty or a democratic political culture. It's rather in defining your own ends, pursuing your own life in your own way. So here, Mill is retaining the Benthamite view that the individual is its own end. That's the aim of liberty, and that's the aim of life, is for the individual to cultivate its own fulfillment or development. He happens to be expanding the picture of how to develop that individual, but that's still the unit of analysis and the project. Now, the enemy to this cultivation lies not, so far, in some internal failure to pursue it, but in the social inclination to refuse this liberty to one another. And let me just say that again. The first danger that Mill takes up very early on in the text is our disinclination to grant such liberty to one another. Our natural inclination, Mill tells us, is to seek liberty for ourselves and conformity from others. We all want to do our own thing, but we all want others to do it too. We have a natural tendency to impose our own morality and our own discovered truths on others, not to encourage the difference or pursuit of their own road on the part of others. And you can see that very clearly on pages 8 through 11, really early in the text where Mill is building up toward enunciation of the principle I just read. So what he gives us as the preface to that principle is the situation in which we are not naturally going to be inclined to make individual liberty the governing principle of society. As he puts it, we want everyone else to agree with us and to be required to act as we act. He calls this social tyranny. It's our natural inclination. So we start with a problem. The thing we most need, maximum individual liberty for all, is the thing we're least inclined to offer one another. Freedom to find our own way. Freedom to discover and contend for the truth. Freedom to refuse custom and opinion as guides. Freedom to choose our own ends and idols. And if you just think about Mill's intuition here, he's onto something. And we can say that we cherish individual liberty, but if somebody really starts acting out in a highly individual way, or doesn't comport with the norms and general mores of society, we think there's a problem with that. But it's important to note in that regard that Mill's not just fighting then the sort of religion and custom and enchantment with authority of the pre-Enlightenment situation. He's not just fighting off the Dark Ages, authority of church and custom and tradition. He also knows that contemporary rationalists believe they've found the truth and believe everyone should live according to it. He knows this is an age that's just hell-bent on truth emerging from enlightenment, and that passion for having truth govern us doesn't comport well with maximizing individual freedom. So Mill's already up against two problems. One, we don't have a social inclination to grant one another absolute and maximum liberty. And two, the age of rationalism itself is inclined to impose truths on human beings rather than let every individual go their own way. Mill wants liberty above all, but he doesn't spurn reason and he doesn't spurn truth. That puts Mill in the very complex position of arguing rationally against rationalist assertions of absolute truth in social, political, and personal life. And I'll just say it again, because it's a complexity that's really going to come out strongly in this text. Mill is going to argue rationally against rationalist assertions of truth governing social, political, and personal life. And put it a little bit differently, he does believe in truth with a capital T. He believes there's a truth in every domain, religious, social, political. He believes there are truths, not just in science, but in society and in politics and in religion. But he also believes such truth must not rule us. We have to be free to find truth, learn truth, or fail to do so. And even if we fail to do so, and even if that failure is permanent, and even if it's socially widespread, even if it's a whole society living in untruth, he wants to affirm the individuality and the liberty that might have brought that condition to be. Which, of course, is one of those paradoxes of democracy. We can look around and say, my God, this country is nuts. Look at all these people wandering around, believing in this and believing in that. But liberty, that's the core principle. Everybody has to be able to do that. Can't impose a truth on people. Mill's up against that problem in a very extreme way because he does not relativize truth. And you're going to see the whole second chapter just working that problem of, okay, why is it okay to keep questioning truth and ignoring truth even after you have established the truth? You watch him struggle with that in chapter 2. All right, let me get to one last thing. This will take 2 minutes and we'll be done, and that's the harm principle. What is it? When Mill says we can do what we want, we should have absolute liberty so long as it doesn't harm another, that second phrase is the harm principle. Liberty is limited only by the extent to which it harms another human being, also entitled to their liberty. Sounds good, but what counts as harming another, especially in conditions of scarcity or proximity? And this will also be a problem not just for Mill, but for millions and million liberals for the next century and a half. When does speech, absolute free speech, harm another? When does private enterprise harm another? When does your freedom to do with you what you will with your wealth or your capital constitute the exploitation of the many? That was Marx's worry. That's Occupy Wall Street's concern. In short, when is your liberty not innocent? That's the hard question. And we'll be taking up that question and a bunch of other questions pertaining to Mill's text on liberty on Tuesday. So I'll just stop there. Let me take your questions or thoughts on Mill. We actually have a whole 10 minutes today. Could be on Mill or Bentham. Yes?
So he doesn't quite have a solution on how to spread the truth. He says that
One more time. He doesn't have a solution to what?
find the truth and spread the truth. So
How does he deal with the truth problem? Okay, so you haven't. So chapter 2. The question is, does Mill have a solution, like how you find the truth, how you spread the truth? Okay, so here's what you're going to find in chapter 2. Mill's going to say, okay, there are ways to get truth in society, and the best way to get truth in society is to have absolute free speech, because the truth will prevail. It will survive. It will thrive. It will finally prevail. Error, the circulation of error, and the contestation of one another's positions will finally produce the truth. And of course, he's picking up from a general notion of competition, from a general economic metaphor circulating throughout society, the idea that the more competition there is, the more contestation there is, the better will be the chance of truth emerging. He's also picking that up. Remember, I mentioned what else was published at the same time as On Liberty, namely Darwin's work. He's picking up that notion also from Darwinism. The problem is, of course, free debate, free discussion, free speech does not always produce the truth. Mill's convinced that it will, and that truth is best established when it's, as he puts it, alive, when it's not dead dogma. So even Christianity, for example, he thinks should be absolutely subjected to argument, contestation, even truths that we know to be absolutely correct. If somebody wants to come along and challenge them in a huge way, let's say we believe that all people are born as equals and in the sense that they all ought to be subjected to the same rights and possibilities as every other human being. And somebody comes along and says, nope, not true. Either on a racial or some other basis, these people ought to be entitled to lots and the rest ought to just be sent off to be little drudge workers because that's the truth. Mill's argument would be, okay, let that circulate. Don't suppress it. Don't. The more that contestation and circulation of ideas, even error-ridden ones, the more that happens, the more that truth will prevail. So it's a Darwinian capitalist notion of the production of truth. Does that get at your question? Okay, you'll see it. You'll see it and I don't mean to disparage it entirely, because he's also trying to argue for the importance of even error being something you might have to live with if it preserves individual thinking and liberty and freedom of expression and mind. Yes?
So if Mill sees like isolation as facilitating, individualism and just as a good thing, how does he not see value in rights as insulating us from each other?
Yeah, I know. It's interesting. So when I said Mill sees isolation as important, what he's concerned with is finding a way to back away from the hum and thrum and overwhelming qualities of society. It's not about needing to carve out a legal space where nobody else can get you. It's about the importance of carving out, as it were, a social, soulful, and mental space for self-development. What he's worried about is very similar to what Tocqueville was worried about, just that we become more and more massified, more and more just bound to the world of fashion, whether it's in ideas or the comportment of ourselves or the rest of it. And he's also worried about just, sort of lowering the level of individual thought as the level of social opinion takes over. So rights aren't important for that. Rights aren't important for, really what we're getting is a social theorist here who wants not our radical hermetic isolation, but our ability to go off on our own and be thinkers, inventors, arrive on our own at our understanding of the world and without the huge press of social opinion. So rights aren't the right tool for that. And again, as you'll see in the subjection of women, he doesn't throw them out, but they're just not central to creating that space for cultivating individual thought and development and perfection. One more question. Yeah?
So he thinks liberty and individuality is the way to the truth, right? So wouldn't conformity be the process of going to the truth? Say, my value is that the world is flat, but then I'm now convinced by my professor that the world is round. So I'm conforming to his values. And isn't it the pathway to go get to the truth?
Isn't what the pathway to get to the truth?
Conformity.
Yeah, okay. So what he doesn't want is for me to convince you that the world is round. What he wants for me to do is give you a lot of arguments for you to go home and think through and test against other arguments, including flat worlders' arguments, He wants you encountering them. He wants us all encountering what, again, he knows we are not naturally inclined to encounter. He wants these people arguing with one another, even though he knows they're likely to shut their ears to each other. So he does not want you to imbibe my truth. He wants you to take in a cacophony of views and produce your own as well in order to slowly generate together what is truly true. Now, the irony is, or the problem is, what do you do after you get there? The world really is round. Let's say we really know the world is round. That's a great example. He wants those flat worlders to keep on coming and stir it up so that we can remember why the world is round and not just take it as gospel. Gospel is the deadening of the mind and the end of the cultivation of what is special about human beings. So everything has to be, as it were, contestable all the time, even when we know it's truly true. Okay, I'll see you on Tuesday. There is a reading assignment for Tuesday. You start reading Nietzsche, a whole different thinker, a whole different world. Still same century, still same scene, a lot of the same anxieties, but very different orientation. Okay, let me just remind you before we dig back into Mill what it means to talk about Mill as a liberal thinker. So to that end, I want to just do a little review of something we talked about some weeks ago, which is the idea of liberalism that precedes our own contemporary usage of it. Today we tend to use it as equivalent to progressive or left-leaning. Usually think of it as having more emphasis on concerns with equality than perhaps on individual liberty, whatever. We have lots of associations with it today. I want you to bracket those and remember its classical formulation. It emerges from the Latin term liberales, meaning a free man. So it's not a political persuasion as opposed to conservatism. Rather, it refers to a form of political organization and a set of political values, both a form of political organization and a set of political values rooted in the primacy of individual liberty, the bottom line quality, as we would say, of individual liberty. Now, with this goes a great deal else. The presumption of an autonomous and self-governing individual, variety of other things. But liberalism really refers to this order of value and order of organization in which individual liberty is primary and the individual is the primary unit of analysis. So liberal democracy is a particular form of democracy in which individual liberty is taken to be the primary value. But there are other kinds of democracy. When we talk about social democracies, or even socialist democracies, we are in a world in which equality, often understood as both social and economic, is taken to be as important as individual liberty. So social democracy puts an emphasis on justice in the social or socioeconomic realm. There's also Republican democracy, which we studied when we thought about Tocqueville, when we worked on Tocqueville, where participation in political life and being part of, an active part of popular sovereignty is taken to be as important as individual liberty. None of these cancel out the existence of individual liberty, but they're introducing other values than, say, liberal democracy, which has individual liberty at its heart. Or there's radical democracy, often understood as the direct power of the people, the direct sharing in public power as the supervenient value, more important than the question of individual liberty. Now, we saw liberalism and liberal democracy criticized by Marx because he doesn't think it realizes true democracy. He thinks it only produces democracy, the sharing in power, at a very formal and abstract level. We also saw liberalism and liberal democracy kind of mildly worried about in Tocqueville. Tocqueville was concerned about too much self-interest, too much withdrawal into personal life to sustain popular sovereignty, to sustain a concern with the people in power, the people ruling. And in some ways we saw liberalism and liberal democracy criticized in Marx, mildly worried about in Tocqueville. In some ways we saw it kind of set aside by Bentham. That doesn't mean he attacked it directly, but it wasn't his main focus. The primacy of the individual's liberty was not at the heart of his concerns so much as the question of how to achieve utilitarian government, where the individual and the many have their pleasures maximized, their pains minimized. Mill is our chance to see liberalism elaborated and praised. This text is often heralded as the ultimate theoretical tribute to liberalism, a real paean to the values of individual liberty, individuality, tolerance, and limited government. That said, it would be a mistake to see this text as only a tribute. Mill is also struggling with liberal democratic values, and he's struggling with a number of tensions that he thinks liberal democratic values produce internally. He is an extremely careful, subtle, thoughtful thinker. And the fact that he reads so easily shouldn't lull you to sleep, because there's a lot of tension and a lot of wrestling going on in this text. It's not only a tribute to the idea of individual liberty limited only by harm that principle might do in the hands of one toward another. Just to give you an overview of the problem we're going to delve into deeply today, Mill has trouble cherishing liberty on its own terms. And by that I mean he cares too much about some other things: truth, enlightenment, utilitarianism, and the cultivation of great individuals, to simply care about liberty as a principle unto itself. He also worries about certain things if liberty is just set loose as its own principle without taking care of anything else. He worries about what he takes to be the political depravity and the social mediocrity that he thinks unlicensed, that handing us all simply the principle of liberty is likely to produce. So in some ways we're back to some of Tocqueville's worries, but from a different angle. Okay, I'm going to treat each of those more deeply as we go along today. What I'm suggesting is that what we have in Mill is a really important set of tensions in liberalism's own cherishing of the individual and liberty as its own value. Mill really foregrounds some of these tensions. And that sets him off from, say, modern libertarians, left or right, where individual liberty is simply a given and the only governing principle, and you don't worry about anything else. You just try to secure it. Mill is a more wide-ranging, thoughtful, complicated, tension-ridden, sometimes contradictory thinker than that. He's trying to conjoin and reconcile individual liberty with other values that libertarians will just treat as supervenient. They'll just treat liberty as a trump. Mill has too many other cares to do about that. As I said, he cares about truth. He cares about cultivating human excellence. He cares about the flowering of civilization. He cares about individually and collectively pursued high values, good things, higher goods. So his care for liberty, his commitment to liberty, is not that of the kind of rugged American live free or die. Rather, his care for it has to do with its contribution to cultivating these higher ends. Although he also sometimes simply sets it out as an intrinsically right principle. Okay, so what we're going to do is work through some of these tensions, starting with the first one that has to do with individuality and truth, and see some of how Mill presents them and what he can and can't solve in them. So individuality and truth. Individuality for Mill requires not just that we determine our own ends, it does require that, but that each of us formulate our own opinions and our own understanding of the world. We talked about that briefly last time. Now the problem with that, the problem with requiring that each of us formulate our own opinions and understanding of the world is that that will set many of us on the path of error and foolishness. And the greater the space articulated for individual reasoning, individual opinion, individual faith, individual discovery, the narrower the space for truth with a capital T to govern. It can't govern. We saw Mill set that aside. He does not want truth discovered and then imposed on us. But there's another problem. The more that we are each set loose to discover our own way and to find reason and truth for ourselves, the greater the possibility of relativism. That big bugbear for the Enlightenment. And this is a problem that many political theorists of the past have also wrestled with from really the beginning, from Plato through Hegel. And some of them dealt with it by simply saying, okay, I'm going to establish philosophical truth as the ordering truth of the regime. And individuality, okay, a little bit here and there, but for the most part, individuals have to comport with the discovered truth of the regime. Mill will not make this move. Rather, he tries to make the best of this predicament. Got to set loose individuals free. They have to discover things their own way. They can't be coerced. Nothing is authentic. Nothing is true for you unless you really come to it on your own. He's going to make the best of that predicament by asserting that error has value for the production of truth itself. That error has its own value. That it forces the project of truth to work harder to assert and to maintain itself. Essentially, what he's relying on here is the principle of competition, drawn both from Darwin and from the political economists. And if you have your books out, it would be great, because we're going to be reading a couple different passages. So I'm going to start on page 20. I'll give you a moment to grab them. All right, so he's in a discussion on page 20 of why you cannot silence somebody, no matter how crazy, no matter how wrong they are, no matter how certain that you are, and that they're wrong. And it first sounds like a kind of principled argument. It's just wrong to do that. But then he says, just about 5 lines from the bottom of that big paragraph, but the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Okay, so far we have an argument that you don't suppress opinion, you don't suppress belief, you don't suppress proclamations of knowledge, both because it's wrong in itself and because it's good to have all these colliding views around, because truth has something to make it stronger. But the trouble is now, what he's done is submitted individuality to a higher value, namely the production of truth and progress. In other words, the reason it's good to let everybody think what they think and say what they think is that that will produce truth and progress, not just because it's good for the individuals, especially the wrong-headed ones. And that That claim contravenes what Mill told us the project of the essay was. Remember the project of the essay on page 13? I won't reread it, but the project of the essay is that there is never an occasion for interfering in an other's view or thought or way of approaching their life other than to preserve yourself. That's the only time you can do it. But what he's saying now is that individuals really do have to be left to their own, often pointless, often wrong-headed, often stupid way of thinking. They have to be left alone, not just to think stupid thoughts, but to live badly. Remember what he told us on page 13, that in interfering with the liberty of another, quote, his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. You can't interfere with somebody's thoughts or way of life or choices just because you think it's bad for them. Now, this idea that you have to let everybody just make their own bad choices, go their own way, is not a problem for a crude liberal, a liberal who just believes in liberty above all. But it's a problem for Mill. Because Mill thinks the value of liberty is to develop individuality and make civilization and life in general flourish. And so part of the point of the individuality that he has cherished is undercut here. Remember, he's not just rooting the value of liberal government, minimalist government, in natural rights or social contract. If he was doing that, it'd be fine. He could just say, everybody gets to lead their own life, go their own way, but whatever happens, happens. The main thing is everyone gets liberty. That's it. That's all we really care about. But that's not what he's saying. He's not saying this is a matter of juridical legitimacy. Rather, he is saying there is moral value and historical value. There's content to these things, and that content is the flourishing of the human being. That's the end. You can see that very clearly in the inscription on liberty from von Humboldt that is placed on page 3 and that Mill again cites in the middle of the text. And I'll just read it to you from page 3. The grand leading principle toward which every argument unfolded in these pages directly converges is the absolute and essential importance of human development in its richest diversity. So human development in its richest diversity is what is being unfolded on these pages. Very close to Marx's argument that rich individual human development is the real point of communism. Of course, Marx has a little more faith in everybody obtaining that than Mill does. But the point is, it's Mill's profound appreciation of human development, human perfectibility, human flourishing, creativity, originality, the great possibilities in human beings. It's his appreciation of that pushed him away from Bentham in the first place. He says at one point, human life is not a machine. It's a plant that must grow and be cultivated and flourish. It's not Bentham. It's something else. On 59, he says, I'm just reading from page 59. Let me tell you if I can find exactly where this is. Very bottom, last 6 lines. It really is of importance, Mill says, not only what men do, but also what manner of men they are that do it. Among the works of man, which human life is rightly employed in perfecting and beautifying, the first in importance is surely man himself. All right, so again, what do we have? We have a commitment to the development of the human species and of the human individual. Our project is ourselves, to make something of ourselves. So we're back to Bentham's problem now, only it's really intensified. Mill does not believe that pushpin is as good as poetry, as Bentham put it, or that McDonald's is as good as the magnificent meal that you can cultivate out of your organic garden. Raw happiness is not enough. Mill wants magnificence and grandeur from human beings. He wants beauty of soul and accomplishment. But he can't violate his most fundamental principle to get it. And his most fundamental principle, of course, is uncoerced, unconstrained individuality. So now what do we have? A tension not just between individuality and truth. What do we do if half the human species, or 90% of the human species, is just on the wrong path, chasing down the wrong pleasures, seeking out the wrong things in life, and living according to false beliefs or living according to very low concerns and not developing themselves? We don't just have a tension between individuality and truth, we also have a tension between individuality and life potentially lived grandly or stupidly and pointlessly. We'll return to this problem when we come back to a larger question, which is the relation of the individual and social coercion or authority. But right now we're going to move to the next tension, individuality and moral progress. Okay, if individuals are going to go their own way, if everybody's going to be set loose to do their own thing, how do we guarantee that they contribute to something that Mill also cares about a lot, which is a progressive project in history, the development of history for the better? How do we guarantee not only that they will advance and develop in and of themselves, but that they will advance history? Remember, for Hegel and Marx, we had a historiography, an understanding of history, in which often history unfolded without our will, without our own understanding of what was unfolding, and we were going to get there anyway. We were going to get to the promised land anyway. But in Mill, what makes history progress is the development of enlightenment and its utilization by individuals. That's what pushes history toward truth, toward freedom, toward creativity, and toward happiness. So what we do and what we think really matters. What you will see when you read the Ude Mehta piece as well is that he describes this tension in Mill in terms of a conflict between attachment to universalism, to belief in universal conditions, and to progress. What Mehta asks is, how can something be universal if it's also only partway down the road to true? How can it be universal if it's only in progress of arriving at the truth? And how can progress itself be reconciled with a condition where the universal truth about human beings and societies already reigns? Those are Mehta's twin questions. How can you be both on the road to your destination and at your destination? He sees this tension everywhere in Mill, where Mill is talking always about developing the progress of developing the human being, developing the human species, developing human history, and also having us already, as it were, be there. Mehta also asks, what's the role of competition in getting to where one must be getting anyway? The larger point that you can see by the questions Mehta adds to our conversation here is that you can see a very strange mixture in Mill of attachments to the idea of enlightenment and individuality and liberty, but also a number of other discourses with other values. And by that I mean social Darwinism, laissez-faire economics, the abstract equality of the French Revolution, and colonialism attached to a set of racial discourses about supremacy and advancement and inferiority and behindness. You see, more generally, liberalism's attachment to psychological and pedagogical and medical therapeutic discourses, they all get blended into a single worldview here, and today as well, but they're often rather inconsistent with one another, and that's part of what we're seeing in Mill's struggle. He's mixing metaphysical histories with very progressive ones. He's mixing peaceful evolutionary understandings, we're getting better because we're simply developing, with very agonistic competitive ones. We're knocking out the bad and making the good thrive. You see in him notions about survival of the fittest combined with notions of universal dignity, the universal value of all human beings. And you also see formulations in him of administration and management and the importance of social organization side by side with formulations of the importance of radical freedom. And I'm emphasizing all of this because it is true of liberalism today as well. It's never a pure discourse. It's never a pure theory. It is never simply something that only values what it says to value. It's always got other things attached to it, whether it's Darwinism or capitalist ideology or various kinds of medical discourses or various kinds of colonial histories and so forth. They're always attached and suffusing liberalism differently in different places and differently in different times. The way we can pursue this problem further today is to consider the next tension in Mill. So we've looked at the tension between individuality and truth. We've looked now at the tension between individuality and moral progress. How do you simultaneously get us progressing, and what does it mean to have us progressing as a species while setting us loose when we might do all kinds of things that don't necessarily seem like they're advancing the species at all or ourselves? What we can take a look at now is the supreme tension in Mill between egalitarianism and elitism. Here we have to start with Mill's belief in progress, commitment to progress, that is somewhat like that of Tocqueville and Marx. He believes we're swept up in a moving forward current of history. But for Tocqueville, remember, that current was powered by an egalitarian force. For Marx, it centered on freedom. We were always reaching for freedom and trying to make the world more free. Even if we failed or only did it partially through many revolutions, eventually we would get there. For Tocqueville, there was a dark side to the possibilities ahead. He had some big worries about a world being made more and more and more out of an egalitarian fabric. For Marx, there aren't any really. The movement of materialist forces in history, abetted by class struggle, eventually revolution, would, in his view, take us to the promised land, where we would all be free and rational and communal and equal and happy. Mill's sort of in between these guys. By which I mean, he's pretty sunny about the idea of progress, but he does have some worries, some Tocquevillian type worries. And it's the worries that he addresses by cultivating a certain elitism in his supposedly universal application of the principle of liberty. Mill's certain that the world is becoming more and more guided by reason, by individual choice, by liberty. He's certain that the beauty and nobility of human beings is emerging more and more. You can see this if you take a peek at page 63. You get a sense of just how things are getting better and better for the human species itself. I'm at the top of the first full paragraph in 63. It's not by wearing down into uniformity all that's individual in themselves, but cultivating it and calling it forth within the limits imposed by the rights and interests of others, that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation. And as the works partake the character of those who do them, by the same process, human life also becomes, watch the values, rich, diversified, and animating. So by rich, really full, diversified, more and more variety, animating, more and more good energies, furnishing more abundant element to high thoughts. So more and more stuff and food for high thinking, and elevating feelings, more refined, better sensibilities and feelings, and strengthening the tie which binds every individual to the race, so also producing, as it were, something closer to species being. By making the race infinitely better worth belonging to, we get more and more attached to humanity. In proportion to the development of his individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others. There's a greater fullness of life about his own existence, and when there is more life in the units, there is more in the mass, which is composed in them. So this is the grandest, the most utopian version of his vision. We are just becoming richer, fuller, brighter, smarter, more creative, more attached to one another, more respectful of each other, less coarse, less vulgar, less animalistic, less crude, etc., etc. But there is also a problem here. And tellingly, it unfolds on the pages just after this paean to what individuality and liberty has generated. What Mill confesses in these next few pages is that originality, born of individuality, is the only thing that's ever advanced the human species. But it's also very, very rare. Most of us will not do anything with or from our freedom. Most of us will just squander it. Most of us, moreover, won't even appreciate originality. As he puts it on 65, originality is the one thing that unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. So when it goes by, we won't even appreciate it. Still worse, as he confesses on 66, collective mediocrity, rule by public opinion, the suffocation of the individual in the mass, this is the real norm of his time. So when this, collective mediocrity, rule by public opinion, suffocation of the individuals in the mass, lack of originality, when all this is combined with what he calls the moderate intellect and inclination of most of mankind, the moderate intellect and inclination of most of mankind, and when he combines it too with the strong inclination to always reform morals in the direction of the mass, to always let the moral values of society be organized by wherever the mass is, you really have a recipe for disaster at this point. Thus, on 68, he describes, just a sentence, a world of increased regularity of conduct, discouragement of excess, one standard for every endeavor and every person. Exactly that uniformity that he hates and that mediocrity that he loathes. The result, he says, is that any part of humanity that really stands out prominently not only won't be valued, it will be, and I'm quoting him, maimed like a Chinese lady's foot. The idea is that the society will bind it, and destroy its beauty and individuality. It can't emerge, it can't flower, it can't lead. So now we have Mill's personal nightmare about the future. A nightmare, no doubt, in part suffused with the nightmarishness of his own upbringing, which had very much this character, but also suffused by his close study of Tocqueville on this subject. This is where he was a really ardent student of Tocqueville on the problem of mass society. But there's something else I want to underscore here, and it's why I've called this particular tension the tension between egalitarianism and elitism, because we need to really grasp Mill's repugnance toward the masses. He has a very low view of their potential, their manners, their tastes, their moral character. Apparently, Harriet Taylor did some things to kind of hedge that, but not a great deal. On chapter 3, you will see this low regard for the mass on every page. Nor do you even just see repugnance. You really also see a certain fear. On 56, he offers a bunch of examples of when free speech is inappropriate. And what really stands out is the example of radical opinions about the exploitation of the poor by the rich that will incite mobs. So the kind of thing going on in Occupy Wall Street. Very dangerous and very inappropriate. So what does Mill want? Mill wants individuality not just for its own sake and doesn't believe we can all have it. He wants liberty not just because it serves the common dignity of mankind. Rather, he wants individuality and liberty because valuing these things is the only way to cultivate the space for the few who will break this tendency toward mediocrity and low-lifeness and carry humankind forward. Liberty, he tells us, is the soil for genius. Liberty is the soil for genius, but genius is rare. So in truth, liberty's not going to do most of us much good. There'll be, of course, the trickle-down effect of the genius upon us. There'll be the way in which history is carried forward, and we're all made better by it. So it will contest our movement toward mediocrity by raising the general level of culture and knowledge. It's kind of supply-side economics at the moral level. But you shouldn't be fooled into thinking that we're all going to contribute to this project of improvement. So to be very clear, liberalism, as Mill represents it so well, casts all of us as rightfully having liberty. There's never a question about that in the Euro-Atlantic world. We're going to get to the rest of the world shortly. But in the Euro-Atlantic world, Europe and the New World, we all rightfully have liberty, but precisely because it's negative liberty, the right to do what you want without being interfered with, he can simultaneously argue that most of us will waste it. Liberty produces natural meritocracy, not equality. The important thing is that no potential genius be prevented from the possibility of cultivating that genius. The important thing is not that all the population be exposed to the kind of education or the kind of cultivation that genius requires. What's important is that the genius not be suppressed or repressed and has the soil to flourish. Okay, now at this point we need to confront the most serious yet really necessary tension in Mill, which is the relationship between liberty and social coercion, or to put it more strongly, the need to deploy social coercion for governance. And it continues our discussion of the problematic masses. So, in thinking about Mill's deployment of social coercion for governance, it's related to what we've been considering, but it's also related to another tension in Mill's work, namely between individuality cherished as an end in itself, just a good in itself, and governance through constraining norms and aims. Mill really does want individuals to be free. He really does. But he also understands that this freedom is producing a new governance challenge. The challenge is that our potential unruliness as free individuals is a problem not only to one another, that's why we have to have the harm principle in there in the first place, keeping us separated, but it's also a challenge for the state. Now, he tries to avoid the sharpness of this problem by first parsing the problem as a question of appropriate domains. And if you look at the opening of chapter 4, which is page 75, you can see that attempt. And note the title of the chapter, of the limits to the authority of society over the individual. So we're going to be discussing the question of the limits of this authority, but that also means that some of that authority is going to be in there. It's a question of where its appropriate limits are. He says, What then is the rightful limit to the sovereignty of the individual over himself? We know that we're supposed to be sovereign over everything that just pertains to us, our personal life, our choices, what we want to eat, what we want to think, what we want to believe, what we want to say. But he's asking now the other question: where does the authority of society begin? How much of human life should be assigned to individuality and how much to society? So note what's going on here. It's not how much should individuality be assigned to the individual, herself or himself, and how much to the state or how much to the law, but how much to society. We're in new territory here, where society is going to give us guidance, limitation, moral authority, and so forth. He continues, each will receive its proper share, if each has that which more particularly concerns it. To individuality should belong the part of life in which it's chiefly the individual that's interested. To society, the part which chiefly interests society. Okay, so far this sounds pretty straightforward. Society's concerned with the part that's social, individual's concerned with the part that's individual, but how are we going to decide this? And more importantly, if he has told us, as any good utilitarian would, society is nothing more than a composite of individuals. It's not something beyond that. It's not an organic thing with its own value and its own participatory domain and so forth. If it's just a composite of individuals, how can it have a share? What does it mean to set a limit on individual sovereignty according to something that's really a fiction? Society, Bentham told us, is simply a fiction. Margaret Thatcher repeats the point in thinking about society. There's no such thing as society. There's only individual women and men. Mill wrestles with this problem for a while before he gets it landed. And here's what he does. First, he suggests, well, we owe society a return for the benefit that it offers us. It's like that thing you learned early on in your family. If you're going to have privileges here, you also have duties. But that's tricky because it's the state that provides protection for us, and also, not society, and also our liberty should never be the price we pay for this benefit. He told us that liberty is uncompromisable. The second move he makes is that the very fact of living in society makes us bound to observe certain rules of conduct, which means not just not injuring the interests of another, and he adds participating in joint sacrifices. But even this doesn't get us to the problem Mill's really concerned with, which is not the problem of how to make us minimally good citizens who pay taxes and obey laws and stop at red lights and serve in the military if called. His problem is how to make us minimally decent human beings, not just law-abiding, but good people. How to keep individualism from turning into selfish, antisocial behavior. Or even just how to keep it from turning into just what he considers kind of disgusting, contemptuous, coarse, poor or working class behavior. Gambling, swearing, drinking, slothful existence. Well, for Mill, obviously you can't use law for this project of making us into decent human beings, because he's committed himself to a minimal state, one that can only rightfully intervene in our freedom on behalf of our of security. So what does Mill have to turn to? He has to turn to social coercion, despite the fact that he spent the first 15 pages of the book telling you how terrible social coercion was and how dangerous it is to the individuality of all of us and how serious an encroachment it is on our liberty. But he tells us at the bottom of 75 that if someone is engaged in a socially hurtful act that is, quote, nonetheless lawful, the offender may justly be punished by opinion. Nor does he set a limit on how far opinion can go. As the problem unfolds in the pages about 76 through 82, Mill makes clear that influence through opinion and counsel and advice and education and, above all, contempt, disdain, that withering thing that we all simply squirm under, whether it's from family or teachers or bosses or anybody else, that influence through opinion and counsel and advice and education and mores or attitudes, that this is crucial in what he calls, quote, the project of human beings helping each other distinguish the better from the worse and being encouraged to choose the better and avoid the worse. Are there any limits to this? Not really, although Mill certainly thinks we should be careful in mobilizing public opinion. But the fact is, as he reminds us, you have the right to spurn public opinion. You can stand up to it. If somebody's disdainful of you, if somebody's correcting you, if somebody is laying on a bunch of views, you can, as he puts it, do the action and stand the consequences. Meaning, you can just say, to hell with you. I don't care what you think. I'm going to do it anyway. So he doesn't feel he has to draw very careful lines about public censure. But he does try to persuade us of a distinction between what he calls matters that are purely personal or self-destructive, as opposed to those which have deep social consequences. So let's see what those are. The matters that he considers purely personal, he can't stand them, but he thinks probably should be left alone or left out of overt social coercion through opinion. These include being, his list, self-indulgent, impetuous, or bad habits such as gambling or drinking. These, he tells us, will condemn you to others' low opinion, but you can do them anyway, and you're really, in the end, just totally punished by your own self-destruction, your own bad life. You're punished more by that than you are by public esteem. But then there's an order of things that he thinks really do hurt others. They aren't technically illegal, but he's got to get them stopped. And they include ubiquitous lying, refusing to protect others from injury, taking advantage of others. Here he says, these are fit objects of moral reprobation and in grave cases of moral retribution and punishment. But now Mill's moving down a very slippery slope. He wants individual freedom and laissez-faire society. Everybody doing their own thing, everybody cultivating their own way, everybody being competitive or not, as it were. But the very market values that he treasures are also those that are going to corrode the whole fabric of society. Lying, refusing to protect someone from injury, taking advantage of someone, these are things that could be said of Wall Street financial managers, not just street dealers. So what does Mill do? He declares these things morally wrong at the extremes, so subject for retribution and punishment. What's happened here is that Mill yearns for individual freedom to turn itself into good and socially beneficial ends, but market society is going to do the opposite. It's going to, as we've already seen, convert us more and more into creatures who are primarily looking out for number one and are perfectly willing, where we can get away with it, to lie, cheat, and steal if we can. And again, that's the story of the ordinary conniving individual as well as the story of Goldman Sachs. And it's not a story Mill's willing to live with. He can't go too far in controlling the problem with law, so he marshals public opinion, social coercion, and what he calls morality to do the job for him. He marshals those social powers coursing through society that he has railed against at the beginning of the book as crushing individuality and as having too much sway over the individual. But the more you read Mill, the more, and the deeper you get into On Liberty, the more you see how heavily he relies on it. So what's really starting to become clear is this. Mill wants to cultivate individuality. in those who know what to do with it. He wants to cultivate liberty in those who will use it well. But he can tolerate a fair amount of social coercion and moral power used against the masses. His egalitarian commitments require that he extend liberty to everybody. And his utilitarianism does too. Someone might discover or create something or invent something or see the truth of something, even if they have lousy character. And he knows that. He knows that good character is not the same thing as being brilliant, is not the same thing as being well-behaved. He knows those things don't all line up. But he's going to use bourgeois morality and its heavy control through social opinion and through what we saw Bentham literally turn into a kind of workshop society, the use of discipline and spatial organization and surveillance and so forth, to turn us into good, conducted, obedient subjects. Mill's not going to go quite that far, but he's going to use, as it were, the tributaries of that. He's going to use the elements of that from social opinion, social coercion, and so forth. A few places outside the text that we're reading where you can really see Mill turn openly in this direction, I'll just give you. These are not in the reading that you have, but in Mill's consideration of political economy, he makes studies of early political economists, including Malthus, the guy who was famously very anxious about our overpopulation problems and the likelihood that if population reproduction continued apace, we would overpopulate the earth in no time. And Mill proposed to alleviate this problem simply by, as he put it, cultivating intense social disapproval of large families. Or, in the argument he makes in Representative Government, for open rather than secret balloting, Mill again says voting should be performed under the eye and criticism of the public. So even though he, again, is standing for popular sovereignty at the level of electoral participation, he doesn't really trust the individual to do the right thing or to do the lofty and noble thing unless watched by each other and especially by lofty and noble powers. He adds, the reason that voting should be performed under the eye and criticism of the public is that, quote, it's less dangerous for the individual to be influenced by others than by, quote, the sinister interests and discreditable feelings which belong to himself either individually or as a member of a class. And the class he has in mind here is definitely the working class. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier in the work on socialism, part of his own attraction to socialism is based on his belief that collective ownership will produce a social milieu in which the lazy can be compelled to do their part because they're hooked to the fate of all. So it's the opposite of what many people's concerns are about socialism. He actually sees that you have a greater problem of what he calls parasitism under capitalism, which you can't solve because it leaves the question always up to self-interest. And if you don't care whether you're rich or poor, then you just won't work. Whereas with socialism, with all of our fates hooked together and all of us caring about the common, forced to care about the common, he thinks this will make the lazy do their share. Now, in each of these cases, the case of Malthusian anxiety, the case of voting, the case of socialism, what you see is Mill focused on a class problem, a problem with class, which is a problem that deepens what I'm calling the elitist strain in Mill's thinking. The kind of opinion that Mill wants to prevail socially, politically, is the kind of opinion that comes from education, thoughtfulness, deliberation. It's that old Tocquevillian aristocratic sensibility that he is trying to inject into a democratic society. He affirms democratic society, but he does not affirm what he considers to be the downward tilt it is likely to take at the level of opinion, comportment, behavior, and values. So, social opinion and social coercion, the kind he's after, is exactly the opposite of what he thinks comes from Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party or a Sarah Palin or something like that. It's precisely not, in his view, the uneducated, the ill-informed, the visceral, the resentful view of the masses. And that's why I'm throwing all sides into this picture, because he would, I think, see all sides in this way. Rather, what he wants is the educated and the proper. He wants what's steeped in learning and steeped in a sense of worldliness that extends well beyond individual concerns and desires to be the guiding social opinion for society and to be that stern look inside and outside that makes you behave well. This is the opinion that is actually to take shape then as a kind of social power. Its purpose is to chastise or shame, not so much to coerce or berate. In other words, trying to suggest, I think it's to be delivered as kind of nose in the air disapproval of certain behaviors, condescension and condemnation, not directly attacking the appetites or the body. Now, of course, there's a question about whether the masses, whom Mill regards as tending toward coarseness and indifference to thought and consideration, will really be affected by such social opinion. Can bourgeois morality touch them? Or will they spurn it? In fact, will they find that kind of morality, will they eventually associate it with latte liberalism and the educated elite and a bunch of others who don't really know what real life is about? The purpose of government here also mirrors this function of public opinion, and this is really the last point I want to make. The purpose of government, like public opinion, is to aid, to stimulate, to deter. It's to give us direction and facilitate our use of freedom, which is why he thinks, for example, public education must be mandated. He's a big believer in it, not just to cultivate the individual, but so the individual will be receptive to understanding what the right way to live is. But government is not to directly do for us or directly tell us what to do. So what Mill's trying to do everywhere he can is keep his liberty principle intact while propping up, or not propping up, working against all the tendencies of this liberty to be squandered, wasted, and head downhill at the level of values and comportment. This class anxiety that I'm suggesting really takes over in the second half of the book gives us a way into the topic that we're going to be taking up on Thursday, which is civilizational discourse in Mill. Why Mill thinks liberty is appropriate for the global north, as we call it today, or the Euro-Atlantic world, but not for the rest of the world. Because despite his low regard for the habits and ways of life of the masses in Europe, he still thinks they're entitled to freedom. And he does not believe that of what he calls the savages in other regions of the earth. But let me just conclude here. The question we're left with today is what to do with this thinker who so powerfully recognized the extent to which liberty, which he cherished so deeply, the extent to which liberty lives and dies in the social. That it's not, as he says early on in the book, just a matter of what government tells you to do. It's also a question of getting society pushed back from the individual. So what do we do with this thinker who so deeply appreciates the extent to which freedom lives or dies in the social, yet secures our liberty only at the formal legal level? The liberty he promises us in this text is that the government will not tell us how to lead our life. That that's what's out of line. And that nobody else can legally tell us how to live our life. In other words, Mill is very sensitive to what he calls social tyranny, social coercion, public opinion. But he not only mobilizes the social to stabilize and elevate society and get it going in the right direction, he also only procures or produces our liberty as formal legal freedom, what Marx called political emancipation, the ability to do what you want without regard to the social powers organizing your life or pressing against your consciousness. Put another way, in some ways we're back in direct confrontation with Marx's critique in the Jewish question. If the social, or what Marx called civil society, is such an important domain of power, and Mill recognizes that it is, what does it mean to set us loose there and then call us free? To say, okay, no more will the government actually restrict your activities. You get to choose your own way of life, your own way of thinking, your own way of doing. You get to say what you want, feel what you want, make a good thing of yourself or a bad thing of yourself, as you will. And what does it mean to make that move and call us free? And at the same time, to use the social as a specific domain of orchestrating and even coercing us so that we do the right things with our lives. Okay, let me stop there. We have a goodly amount of time to talk today. So questions or arguments?
So the article you sent us about Steve Jobs and combining friendship, you can see how Marx would probably criticize Marx or our society for not seeing, just being infatuated with the magic of the iPhone and not seeing what we're creating it. When Mill responded differently that the society that we've sort of cultivated a society in which that individualism exists that allows the genius of Steve Jobs to flourish.
Great question. I'm going to repeat it for all of you because I think many of you will appreciate it. So I sent around the article that was sent to me by someone about Steve Jobs, and it was, as you recall, about commodity fetishism and what the fetishism of Apple products buried in their actual social relations. And the question was, okay, we can see what Marx's criticism would be. It would be, yeah, look at, you guys are all wrapped up in what he calls the magic and necromancy of your object. You love your iPhone, you love your Mac, you love your iPod, etc. And you can't wait for the next iteration of them all. And buried beneath that, or buried in those objects, are these labor practices, these environmental practices, the true social relations that generated them. But your wonderful question is, how would Mill regard this? What would Mill's response be? Would he say, well, okay, that's whatever, that might be true, but what he's focused on is the true genius of a Steve Jobs. Is that how we would compare these two theorists on this problem? I'm going to throw this back out to you. I'll give you my thoughts, but I think it's interesting to just kick it around a little. Way in the back? Nope? Okay. How do you think Mill would respond? Yeah.
I think Bill would say that is the individual liberty of Steve Jobs or Apple to exploit those people because it is legal in China maybe, but we will use that social coercion to say, oh, this is wrong. Maybe we will force Apple to change to a different supplier, something like that, and so that we are heading in the moral and good direction instead of just the individual liberty.
Okay, so you sort of brought Mill together with a social reformist agenda, but the first move I think you made was the admiration for a Steve Jobs. There we are. There's the guy who that's why we have liberty. That's what it's doing. It's your point. It's cultivating a Steve Jobs. And I'm not sure how you got to your second move. Can you explain how Millian orbit, as we've read it so far at least, would lead us to a concern with social reform?
I'm just saying because he still argues for some sort of moral value that you just can't do anything that is legal but will harm other people.
Okay.
Like exploiting workers.
I think our hard question here is what that. It's one thing to harm people. It's another thing to be in a system of exploitation that we don't yet have a clear sense of where Mill is. Because he's all in favor of competition and he's certainly all in favor of freedom. And I think your question was, is he really doing that kind of political emancipation thing where he just sets us loose and then says, okay, go for it? And so whatever happens at the level of production or the level of exploitation is beyond the ken of government? And you're suggesting, well, yeah, except we know this is a guy who doesn't want deep harms to happen in society. But we don't know yet whether we can bring him to the threshold of capitalism. There was a contribution way in the back. You. Didn't you? Yeah. Try a little bit louder.
How geniuses brings progress to society. So we know usually encourage them.
Okay, so would this mean that even if there's a little bloodshed on the way, that what Apple offers, what Steve Jobs offers, is that progress that is itself just worthwhile? It's a thought? Yeah.
I'm not sure it's a contribution, but I'm wondering how much would Mill care for the difference between economic progress in terms of Steve Jobs creating, these products and money and all that, and the idea of progress more of a human or ideological. Maybe I perhaps when I'm reading it, I would perhaps consider that he would be more inclined to favor more ideological progress.
Certainly in this text, I think you're absolutely right. That is a contribution, because what we see is not a focus on the development of wealth or the development of production or the development of technology. We see the development of humanity. And that for him is about more education, more creativity, more inventiveness, more science, more art, more poetry. It's not limited to rational and economic things. It's just more of these things, more cultivated and more appreciated than ever before, and perhaps more widely spread across a larger group of people. And we're not seeing so much in this text any kind of concern with economic progress, nor with the question of what we could call exploitation, or we could just call maldistribution of resources and wages across the world. We don't see Mill taking a position against free enterprise by any means. But you're absolutely right to divide those kinds of progress up. I think he wants, if we don't call it ideological progress, in his words, it's civilizational progress. Yeah?
So I guess we can look at the exploitation of labor in countries like poor countries. We can look at that as the errors that we make as we progress.
Okay, could be looked at as the errors we make. Part of the problem, of course, with Mill in this text is that he really is drawing a boundary around Western civilization. He really is drawing a boundary around Europe. You see it very early, I believe it's on page 13, where he just says, look, I'm talking about peoples who have already reached a certain stage of enlightenment. And so leaving the rest of those people out for what he calls appropriate rule by despotism, we also don't know if that means he's leaving them out for appropriate exploitation by capital in the first world. We're extrapolating too much now. We don't know where to take him. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead. You can stay on this topic.
Go back to the first thing you said about whether Mill and Marx both have an objection to the type of solution like Steve Jobs and Apple. And I think they'd be maybe not for the same reasons, but a similar conclusion. And I think Marx is pretty obvious, but for Mill, I would imagine he has this almost deontological form of ethics where we have this duty to be proper, and fetishizing a person or an object goes beyond the bounds of what is rational or what someone could legitimately believe, to the point where it's not in keeping with these enlightening ideals that he holds up.
Okay, so we have a wonderful contribution here suggesting that given the tacit ethics in Mill, that I think you're suggesting, you're almost wanting to make him into a Kantian, who could not use another for your own purposes. Each person has to be respected as their own end, as being their own end, as having their own purposes. And so they couldn't be used by one another. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's part of it, and I think that's why you mentioned that. But there's also that believing that the goodness that you
Great. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit more confused, but I feel like if you use the word fetishism, that obviously sounds a bit wrong, but if it, as you said, Mill would prefer poetry to pushpins. If we somehow attribute certain artistic qualities to the parts of apple, and if we say that people are mourning instead because of certain artistic properties that people honor, is it really against Mill necessarily against the glorification of Steve Jobs?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think anyone's saying he's against the glorification of Steve Jobs. So I think you're absolutely right that this is the idea that he has in mind. It may be a little bit on the economic side of the development of culture, but he never says he's against that. It's just that more and more these days we think of people who are propelling civilization forward as, I mean, it's just very striking that Steve Jobs has been in the news now for a week. I mean, he's every day on the front page of the New York Times, another item about his life or another item about his memorial. And but I think it's safe to say that you're absolutely right that Mill would not be against that kind of appreciation. He wants innovation and invention and development and aesthetics and all of those things. I think what's made our conversation somewhat confusing, but in an interesting way, is what would he do with that hind end of the Jobs problem that was brought to the fore by the particular article I sent you, which is, okay, what about the actual production of the products? Where would Mill come in on that? And we're having trouble making him come in on that because we don't have him on the subject of political economy in what we've read so far. We just don't. Yeah.
Sorry, I just think another thing that Mill would probably address would be the nature of the product that Steve Jobs sort of mass-produced, which is, I mean, the fact that the mass production of the iPods and Macs and all that sort of made it cheap enough so that a lot of people, especially in the developed country, could get them. And I wonder what Mill would think of the effects of those things. Like, are iPods just turning people away from other people and from knowledge and from those things that he really values, or is it really a contribution?
It'd be great to have Mill sitting here talking about this because, this is the debate of our time, right? Which is, when somebody's sitting around playing Fruit Ninja on their iPod, are they like, is that pushpin? Yes, that's definitely pushpin. I just grabbed a very benign example. I know there are other things that would be less benign that you could be doing with your iPod. But if you are, looking up some obscure reference that comes up in a conversation and suddenly you're able to develop a whole new thought, a whole new idea, we know technology is not in and of itself anything. We know that it has many possibilities. So we would probably want Mill in on that conversation about, has the development of this thing helped us develop in the ways that he cherishes? And he cherishes, bigger, loftier, more fully realized, enriched human beings, not Fruit Ninja players and not, people just compulsively texting, hi, where are you? I'm here, I'm there, I'm, whatever we do, all the things we all do. So the question is probably not the technology and probably not even the question of its distribution, but what it is enabling or disabling. And who knows? This is not his world. We're asking him to be in a world that he can't. But it's an interesting problem. Anything else on Mill, or you want to just keep hanging out with iPods? Go ahead.
I was going to follow up on my question. Does he have, how does he place value on progress? How does he value the technology of the iPhone? Or how many Chinese lives is an iPhone? Or
Okay. Yeah, great question. So what is his measure of progress? What is his measure of, how does he measure, and what is his measure of lives? What is the value of a life? And what is the value of a life in the mass? And is that the same as the value of a life of an individual? That's a really important question for Mill. And I'll just give you my speculative answer. Just again, remember I said Mill wrote a lot, and it's not all commensurate with itself. So I'm trying to just stay inside this text more or less and give you a few things from the outside of it. So I think it is safe to say that Mill measures progress in a way that has to do with what he considers the perfectibility of the human being. And the perfectibility of the human being is precisely not what he thought the Benthamite education he got developed in him. He was highly educated, but what did he miss? Creativity, profound sense and sensibility, deep feeling, an aesthetic appreciation of the world, making the world more aesthetic. So Steve Jobs might have a part in that. But also a world in which liberty was more and more used to develop the world as a whole and the individual. That passage I read you early on, where it's about, as the individual becomes more completely realized and richer and fuller, so also does that person attach more completely to the species, which itself seems more inspiring. So he has a picture of enlightenment, but also the romantic strain that's going on at this time in history that's countering pure rationalism, as developing the possibility of a perfected human being who is knowledgeable, cultured, sensitive, compassionate, worldly, and making the greatest use possible of their liberty, not engaged by vulgar tastes and stupid pursuits. So there's Mill on that. Now the question is, does he think the masses are capable of that? Mostly not. That's my reading of him. That he thinks the world is progressing in that direction, but the class problem, as long as there is one, is going to leave a big chunk of the world behind. And so their exploitation, as we've been putting it, or their use for other things, might not bother him as much as it would bother a Marx. That's my speculation. Go ahead. You can have one response.
So, Mill's idea would be if Steve Jobs created the iPhone, but then didn't publicly trade Apple and wanted to just do it for the good of the world.
Question was, Mill's idea would be Steve Jobs creates Apple, didn't publicly trade it, and just distributed them? Didn't make billions? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that would be the thing he would care about. I think that what Mill would care about is whether we have a world in which education and art and poetry and deliberation and thought are themselves flourishing. And if Apple could help with that, great. But I'm not sure he's worried too much about the exploitation distribution question. All right, I'll see you on Thursday. Finish your Mill reading. All last Mill questions on Thursday.